Winter 1969. The old Quaker meeting house in southeastern Ohio is pulled down to its stones. In the hidden cellar, a mason finds a wrapped ledger sealed with beeswax and 3 small suit handprints set side by side upon the wall. Inside the ledger, 3 terse entries from 1856 in the steady hand of a midwife and a Quaker elder. 3 boys born under duress while slave catchers circled the ridge. 3 notes that repeat like a drum. The lantern split its flame into 3 and mended, and every clock we owned fell still at the same minute. A second find follows years later, a shoebox of singed scraps hidden behind a stair tread. A physician's draft to the Cincinnati Medical and Surgical News reporting a singular triplet case exhibiting simultaneous vascular reflex and mirror touch, torn across the middle. A U.S. Marshal's summons dated the same week and then struck through. Someone wanted this birth pulled into daylight. Someone else shoved it back beneath stones. The family line of those boys has guarded a private liturgy for more than a century. 3 knocks at a door means gather. Never speak a full name alone. One of the granddaughters insists the men of the line can still stop a clock at 3:33 by laying a palm upon it and asking kindly, "Stay with me." Subscribe if you dare to step into a hidden room where law hunted and mercy risked everything, and 3 newborns learned to breathe against the world and comment, "Where are you watching?" But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? They took the meeting house down to its stones and found the room that was never meant to be seen. Winter of 1969 came down hard on the ridge in southeastern Ohio. The men from the county had orders to clear the old Quaker house before the roof took the road with it. No plaque. No signboard. Only a square of weathered clapboard with a door that had learned to keep a secret for 100 years. They pried at the sills and eased the first stone aside. Cold air moved upward, and then stopped as if it had to remember permission first. Someone fetched a flashlight. It walked a thin path across brick and beam and a ring of packed earth. There was the stair that never showed itself from above. There was the shelf where jars would have stood under fruit and code. And on the wall at shoulder height 3 black handprints set side by side in suit that had not let go of the lime. The mason swore, because swearing is what men do when they know they are not to speak louder than a room that has kept its own breath. His glove brushed something wrapped and bound under a fallen bench. Beeswax tugged at the cloth and kept the packet safe the way a hive does when it has decided honey belongs to winter. He carried it up to daylight and did not hand it to a foreman. He set it on a ladder rung, because ladders are the only honest tables at a demolition. He worked the wax free with his thumbnails and breathed the smell of old linen and older ink and a little of the cellar's damp. The first page lifted and the light found it the way water finds a bend that matches its shape. Plain hand, steady, dates without flourish, words that spoke as friends speak when weight sits upon them. A midwife named Ruth Haynes, a Quaker elder who signed only with an initial and the word clerk. 3 entries, 3 nights, the winter of 1856 in a basement that was not to exist and did. 3 children born under the floor of a house that in daylight said nothing above a whisper. 3 notes that came again and again through the lines like a small hammer on iron. The lantern split its flame into 3 and mended. Every clock we owned fell still at the same minute. There are ledgers that try to tell you who wrote them. This one did not try. There is iron gall ink that breaks a page with rust when it has been offended by air. This ink stayed dark enough at the strokes and gentle where the pen had pressed too hard. There is paper that only pretends to be rag and dies as wood does. This paper held its patience. A pressed blade of grass slept by a gutter fold and did not mind being awakened. The hand moved without vanity and without fear of simple words. The hand wrote, "We were tried, and we were preserved," and then did not name who had done the preserving, because friends are careful not to let pride have a handle. The ledger did not sit still in history long. Years later, and the meeting house was only a bony ring. Someone lifted a loose stair tread in a house 3 farms over. There was the kind of shoebox that holds what a life cannot afford to set on a shelf. Singed edges, shy scraps, a draft in a physician's cramped hand addressed to the Cincinnati Medical and Surgical News. Singular triplet case exhibiting simultaneous vascular reflex and mirror touch. The sentence ended in the white where fire had worked. Another sheet carried the words United States Marshal and summons, and then the name of the township, and then every line was struck through, as if the paper had been ashamed of itself and corrected its own breath. Around those two scraps lay little pieces that fill a room without making a wall. A letter without a greeting that mentions 3 knocks, and a night when the north door was not a door. A penciled calculation that stops at 3 and 3, and then refuses to name the hour in digits. Every piece fit a story. Every piece had been worried by fire enough to make certainty a poor neighbor. Somebody wanted what happened in that cellar, pulled into daylight and measured. Somebody else knew that a measurement can kill a thing before it has finished teaching you how to stand near it without scorning it or worshipping it. The ledger went under beeswax. The shoebox went under a stair. The suit hands stayed where the hands had been, because suit does not travel the way paper does. It clings and reminds and refuses apology. You can see the rest of the room when you look hard enough. The lower door that was a wood box by day and a mouth by night. The small cast iron stove sagging at the shoulder, because it had been fed too hot with fear and oak. The little shelf that held a compass that was not supposed to be seen. The quilt with the pattern of 3 pinwheels that meant nothing to men who do not read cloth and everything to a woman who knows how to make a wind blow without danger. Whoever wrote the ledger walked that room with her feet, and those words under a lantern that knew more than it should have been asked to know. The entries did not speak of theory. They spoke of bodies in labor, and of men above with pistols and papers, and of 3 cries rising in one breath, and of a ring of frost on the kettle when fire said it was hot. They did not call anything miraculous. That is not a word the ridge owes any man. They wrote the way water writes stone, when it has earned the right to say it has lived there a long time. The first entry carried the weight of snow on the boards, and the simple sentence, I was called to the lower room. The midwife wrote a woman heavy, with 3 carried down. She wrote that men passed a knock along the joists above 1 to call, and 3 to answer, and no words. She wrote the lantern hesitated, and then remembered and lit again. She wrote the first boy showed no chill though my hands were blue. She wrote that every clock they owned did the same insolent thing at the same minute. Not stopped by cold. Not broken. Halted like beasts when a friend lifts a hand for silence. The candles were asked to divide their fire and did, and then mended. The phrase "we were preserved" sits on that page like a cup of water on a bench near a woman who has just given her strength to the work and is waiting for the next wave to ask more. The second entry repeated the small words and paid attention to the scattered bits that make a room a proof, whether you meant it or not. 3 blankets in 3 corners for the boys. No corner kept its sleep very long. When one child stirred, all the eyes in the room learned to turn the way the 3 learned to turn. A pocket compass placed on a beam pointed north, until it remembered that north may need to be the wall for a night. The children opened their mouths together. They closed them together. When the midwife pricked one heel, because medicine deals in the small, and the measurable, her page admits that red marked more than 1 blanket, for a reason she could not bring herself to name. Above the floor men breathed in fear, and below the floor 3 chests learned how to braid air. The third entry was steadier in tone. There is nothing so plain as a Quaker clerk when a man who has lived too close to death needs to come back into a sentence. He wrote a physician came with sleet in his coat and skepticism in his face. He wrote the physician placed fingers upon 3 wrists and lifted them away as if he had touched a wire. He wrote the pulses began together, and then drifted, and then began again when a certain word was spoken. He wrote the physician held a mirror to catch one reflection, and set it down hard on the shelf after, because the glass had made a decision that a room cannot make. He wrote 3 knocks sounded on the outer door, and 3 answered from the cellar though no hand moved. He crossed out the hour, because he knew that speaking a number can call it back when you do not need to see it again. He wrote we chose to keep silence and went upstairs, because silence is the last skill left to people who have told the truth, until the truth has made targets of them. That would have been enough to build a legend in any county, even if nothing else had been carried into daylight. But the Ridge keeps a second ledger. Families write their own minutes in the way they keep house, and walk to a door, and teach a child to hold his breath when a dog listens beyond a fence. The lines that came from those 3 boys' lives carried on without asking anybody for permission to be private. 3 knocks at a door in that line still means gather. Do not open. Gather. If you speak a full name in that family alone, in a room, somebody will interrupt you with a hand that looks like instruction and gentleness at the same time. They learned not to speak a name without making room for another name to stand beside it, because of a night when a name was a direction plain enough to get a dozen people past a man with a badge and a gallon of hate in him. One of the granddaughters told a county clerk in 1957 that her uncles could halt a kitchen clock at 3 and 3 and 3 by laying a palm upon its face and asking kindly. She told him kindly matters. The county clerk wrote a note to himself and did not record that line in the book he kept for men who like numbers. A WPA inventory man in 1937 wrote a single triangle in a margin beside the word cellar with 3 suit prints at shoulder height. He meant look again. In 1954, when a county historian retyped the card, she did the bars and the benches and the deeds and left the triangle behind. In 1981, a librarian cleaning a drawer of old cards found that graphite bright as if it had been laid down that morning and copied it and put both cards back, because some things live best when paired. Clocks in that county have been known to lose their way for a minute, where nobody watches them. 333 is only a number, unless it is the minute your house learned to hold still and listen for men who carry the law incorrectly. If a man from that line sets a hand upon a clock and asks a favor, the minute hand will sometimes slide into place without the gears giving a reason. He does not make it a show. His sister knows what he has done, because the quilts in the hallway know what has just been saved from shame. Strangers do not get to take that measure. This is the cold open. We have lifted a stone, and we are looking at pages and suit and hands that meant to do no harm, and did only what they could afford. There is a shoebox behind a stair with a physician's sentence that was torn where you need it most. There is a summons that learned the dignity of a line drawn through it. There are 3 small black hands on a cellar wall that has not breathed fresh air since the men who made it died, without telling their sons where to find it. There is a family that answers with 3 knocks to a quiet that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a choreography they learned in the dark. Why did this happen, and why was it erased? Because in 1856 the law allowed itself to get inside a man's pocket and call itself righteous. Because a meeting of friends built a second room inside their house and put their courage inside it, and had to admit a night arrived when courage had to share its breath with something it did not understand. Because there were men above with lanterns and pistols and papers, and men below with water and cloth and prayer, who did not intend to be called holy, and were, and 3 boys who learned to move the air together, because danger taught them to. Because a draft climbed a stair to a city, and somebody pulled it back down and set it on fire, and somebody else pulled it out of fire long enough to teach you a phrase, and then trusted an old scout trick to hide the rest. We will not be adored for what we find. People who guard these things do not invite announcement, but if you hold the page right and breathe like a friend, when weight sits on a room you can still see the lantern splitting its flame and mending, and the hand that wrote we were preserved trying to stay ahead of a number that does not belong on any clock, and which still insists on teaching us how to lay a palm upon a face and ask kindly. Maps lied by omission, and the Ridge let them. In the middle years of the 1850s, surveyors flattened southeastern Ohio to grids of ink and measurement, and then looked up and discovered a body that would not submit entirely. The Muskingum feeder roads took freight by day, salt iron, hogs on foot, and by night they became something else, a string of quiet decisions. The Hocking valleys ran like veins, narrow and cold, wooded to the edges with oak and beech, Between them, townships kept two sets of directions, what you could say in daylight in a court, and what you could only pass along with a lantern covered by a hat. The Fugitive Slave Act still breathed its authority into men who brought papers and pistols across a river and called it law. Marshals took fees, slave catchers took faces and made their own ledgers. On the Ohio itself, ice came late in that winter of 1856, broken plates riding down from Wheeling, banging the piers at Marietta where the ferries tied up and a man could stand and be asked by his conscience, "Do I look away now, or do I move my hands?" The Underground Railroad was neither railroad nor underground except when it had to be. It was a geography of nerve and silence, rooms built inside rooms, doors called wood boxes until midnight needed a different name. Quakers kept minutes in plain hand that named oats, roofs, elders traveling in, gospel service, returns of letters, and then now and then a sentence like a well that does not give you its bottom. Friends met in wait. We were tried and preserved. No names. No superlatives. The discipline would record a breach if one happened. A hat worn in vanity. A marriage out of unity. And yet a night could pass where the greatest breach of the century, by statute's measure, harboring, would leave only a seam of ink in a ledger and a sense among the older men that if your heart beats hard enough, the book must be kept still. The meeting house stood where it had stood, clapboard and spareness, a single room with movable partitions so men and women could meet separately and together, stoves that coughed. You would think the floor was honest pine, boards you could sweep and hear under you like any honest floor. Beneath it lay the thing the maps refused and the law insisted did not exist. A drop, partial stair, dirt tamped by too many feet, a brick wall freckled where moisture had taught lime how to tolerate fear. The shelf disguised as a fruit store, the panel for the wood box that lifted and then did not lift, and then did because a hand knew where to press the knot. The code grew by necessity and by practice. 3 knocks answered once now, 2 answered twice. Quilts with pinwheels and hourglasses hung outside when certain eyes needed to read a sky without clouds and be told where a safer bend lay. A compass might be left on a sill and face the wrong direction all night, as was right for a house that had determined not to tell any stranger its choices. Songs learned in fields found a use in woods. There were families whose feed bins emptied too quickly that winter because bread had to be made at midnight, and not for the people whose names were in the census. Doctors argued within a day's ride of all of that, and called their quarrels progress. Cincinnati took a pride in printing journals that sounded like they carried the state in their pocket. The Western Lancet, the Cincinnati Medical and Surgical News. Men wrote there of reflex sympathy, of mirror sensation in paired subjects, of mesmerism in parlors where ladies reclined backward into chairs and forgot their names, of the new galvanic battery that could coax a frog's leg into an unwanted kick. A Marietta man, trained barely enough to sign his letters MD, wrote a report of a set of twins who shared a rash and a fright, published by the kindness of the editor. A country doctor from Vinton County wrote back and lectured him gently about good bark and bad habits, and the danger of letting your sense live by your spectacles. Electrobiology, one of the decade's entertainments, walked through the river towns with portable Faraday cages and a confidence men mistook for wisdom. A lecturer with a polished skull under his arm would talk of fluid passing between bodies, of an invisible conductor in air. Afterward, a certain kind of man brought what he had learned into his meeting and spoke it too loudly. Quakers did not welcome that tone. They waited for weight. They measured by a peace that would not be hustled. When something happened that could not be named by the journals and had no use for a stage, they did what they had always done. They removed wonders from their own speech out of a suspicion that pried lives in adjectives. Bleeding Kansas had begun to soak newspapers and hearts by then, and Ohio's south, eastern counties felt the pull of westward rage. Men in Athens and Washington and Morgan counties argued in kitchens about whether they were abolitionists or merely not cruel. Some sheriffs collected their fees and shrugged about the rest. Some looked at their fathers' faces and remembered the day a man from Virginia had walked a stranger boy through town by a rope and called him property, and then told their deputies to go home early with a cough. The black laws had been softened in 1849, and yet prejudice kept its own code, moral and cheap. On the river towns, certain innkeepers did not own mirrors, and that was not an accident. Quakers spoke among themselves in ways that baffled law. Thee and thou for equality, plain speech even to magistrates, refusal to take off a hat in homage, refusal to swear. Yes, to speak the truth as God knew it, and not desire to bind it with anything more dramatic than a breath. When a marshal held up paper in a meeting, a friend looked at the paper, and then at the human being the paper hunted, and decided sometimes that the paper was an error in handwriting. The minutes show those divided loyalties in the faint self. Scolding of sentences like, friends were exercised under a concern that some may act in zeal without knowledge. Later, they lose their patience and right. Friends wish not to be instructed by those whose acquaintance with the cross is more by occasion than choice. A birth went on. Ruth Haynes, midwife, friend in good order, kept her bag near, lard and lye shears boiled and cooled, linen folded under the bench. She had delivered in kitchens, and in barns with children crouching under the table and men standing in the yard, pretending tobacco can accomplish mercy. She had learned what a woman's body says, when it is only tired, and when it is tired of the world. She would not have called herself brave, and would not have allowed anyone else to try it. She carried into her work the calm the meeting carried into theirs. Some truths deserve neither shouting nor silence, but the kind of plain telling that makes a door a door. Medicine in those counties split itself into 3 camps and quarreled at the edges for bread. Regulars with their calomel and bloodletting and hard Latin, Thompsonians with cayenne and vapor baths, and a democratic hatred of Lancet men, eclectics arising from Cincinnati's own schools, named for choosing the useful. Worcester Beach's progeny, squeamish about mercury, proud of their herbs. Ether and chloroform had found their ways into the lists, and births went easier in some rooms and not in others, and Quaker women knew when a man had made a woman sleepy, so he did not have to listen. Clocks in those rooms were things men looked at, and then forgot. Shelf clocks with 8 day works and painted glass that had faded to sentimentality. Brass works if a man had money he was ashamed of. Wooden if he called himself plain and meant it, and meant also that he lived far enough from a road that no one would come in the dark. Friends frowned at showy brass. Some meeting houses had removed their proud faces from their walls, because measuring time too loudly is a way of forgetting how weight counts. Still, clocks stood in corners and kept the world from falling into one long day. The telegraph had reached across to Zanesville and would reach farther. Wire made of iron hung on poles. Crows sitting and wondering what the new fence meant. A line to Marietta meant news could arrive with less dust on it than before. People made the mistake of believing fresh news is always truer news. The Underground Railroad taught them otherwise. Word went by feet, little ones and quick ones, men and women you would not have noticed under a store awning. Word went along fences and under fence rails and across ridges in 2 knocks and 1 answer. Word went by quilt and by apple pie. It came into the cellar by a man who knocked with a rhythm that said he had not forgotten to be a friend that day. Everything respectable stood in its skin as it should. The meeting house knew which way to face in a storm. The men knew where to hang their coats and where to lay their hats to avoid vanity. Women knew how to keep a bench clean and a conscience cleaner. The children knew how to hang on to a coat on a dark road in a way that felt like both fear and reverence. The sheriff knew how much to pretend not to hear when a man training a new deputy at night looked the other way along the creek. The mayor in a small town wrote to Columbus about common nuisances and then wrote privately to a friend 2 townships over. I trust thee will do as thee is inclined in the matter we discussed, and that the law will mind its own business. Danger walked the ridge like a man who knows the path by heart. Slave catchers traveled in pairs and in threes, some sober in their brutality, some drunk, all convinced that a trip across a river made them right. They used dogs when they could, and then told themselves they had not. They showed papers to men who had been taught to read, and to men who had forgotten how as a luxury they could not afford. Marshals came in daylight and expected obedience. They were sometimes given hospitality and asked by the meeting to sit and to consider whether paper that hunts men can be true. Many did not consider long enough. Winter explained itself by ice and by chimney smoke. Stoves in the meeting coughed and had to be humored. A small stove will not perform a miracle for a large room. A small stove in a small room can make a law for a night. You can see it in the way the pipe goes up and takes a bend. You can hear it in the noises a cast iron makes when one hand feeds it more than it wants, because fear does not bother with proportion. Frost sets in rings, the kettle rim going white, while the handle stays black and greasy. Men who live on ridges learn these physics without needing a doctor to name them. When a winter comes that seems to alter the manners of flame and frost together, a prudence lives in not shouting, even if a lantern hesitates as though thinking itself in two minds. The ridge politics ran under and around everything. In Washington County, a man at Harmer could buy sympathy along with nails. In Morgan County, some men wanted to be told what to do and preferred to be paid. In Athens County, students at the new college brought talk of abolition to rooms not ready for it, and were lifted kindly by older men and set down outdoors with hats handed back to them, as if to say, "It is a pity to waste your breath in here." Belper and Putnam had long reputations, friends and Presbyterians working in that reluctant fellowship that danger can make. The meeting houses learned how to keep their own souls, and then how to open those souls into rooms wide enough to hide 50 names. This is how things looked before a midwife was called down a narrow stair. A room built to not exist. A law that stated plainly that the room must not exist. A cupboard with a false back deep enough to hold a boy under a quilt and a compass, deep enough to hold a shoebox, and a ledger sealed against damp by wax taken in summer from a hive. Elders who sat in silence until silence broke into leading. Women appointed as overseers for the discipline of women, one of them being Ruth Haynes, who had put more babies than she could number into arms, and still remembered the weight of each as being the exact sum of a hope and a debt. A physician in Marietta proud of his case histories, and a physician in the township proud that no one had died in his hands the winter before. The line to Cincinnati that would make a man certain that his report carried more importance because the city had made a space for it in print. The respectable surface is not a disguise. It is a coat the ridge made for itself to wear in bad weather. It keeps wind from lungs and keeps pride from becoming a sin worse than silence. A ledger with oats and roofs and friends traveling in service might open its page and take an entry none of those men ever expected to write. It might mention a thing it had no taste for. The hour clock refused to carry, without trailing adjectives behind it like a child's tin cart. It might note a physician and a marshal and a lantern learning new tricks, and refuse to name them wonder or devil. In a year when the state demanded all men choose, the medical journals would prefer the boys of that winter to walk into their columns in an orderly way. The law would prefer those boys not to have existed in Ohio at all. The meeting preferred that the mercies of that night be kept from advertisement. The family preferred to call what had been given to them a skill, sometimes, and sometimes, a burden, and sometimes, the way we are made, depending on who listened and how quickly that person judged. The county preferred to pass their house in daylight, and to forget that at night small knocks could mean life, and to scold those who could not forget, because forgetting in certain seasons is the last kindness a place has left for itself. You must understand all of this before the ledger's plain hand makes its first note in that hidden cellar. Otherwise, every strange word that follows, lantern splitting and mending, clocks stopping like beasts trained in meeting decorum, will ask for the wrong sort of attention. The context is the caution. Friends met in wait, and the wait was not theatrical, it was winter, it was law. It was the difference between a paper that calls a child contraband and a hand that keeps a child warm by laying it upon a stovepipe to judge whether a room has gone too cold for remaining honest. Night 1, they brought her down the narrow stair, because the broad world had decided to hunt her. The meeting house had learned how to open its own floor without making a noise. The panel lifted into the woodbox space with a breath, the elder's hand finding the knot like a man who can locate his own pulse in the dark. The lower room took her, and the midwife and the elder, and the one lantern that had to be asked twice that winter for everything it gave. Snow had begun while daylight still pretended optimism. It thrummed against the stones in a fine, tireless needle. Upstairs the men worked the stove wrong. Too much at once, too little a minute later, because fear has no sense for proportion unless somebody bids it. Below, the small iron did its best a red circle, blue rim. Ruth Haynes set her bag on the shelf disguised as fruit space and took off her gloves with teeth, because fingers in such nights forget politeness. Lard, thread, clean cloth. She checked the corner where the waste bucket would sit. She checked the length of the cord on the lantern. She checked the breath of the woman who had carried 3 boys through a world that did not want even one of them to survive that night. The elder above struck the signal along the posts with the heel of his hand. 1 knocked to ask, 3 to answer, and his right palm made less sound than his left, because he had learned to keep his hands honest at worship and rude only in emergencies. The meeting had long ago stitched the code into muscle. 2 means back, 1 means ready, 3 means gather without a sound. The joists took the news along themselves like a line under river water, arriving without splashing. The lantern hesitated each time Ruth lifted it to see what she could not feel. Its flame thinned to a string and then returned to a tongue as if it remembered instruction. Single, then 2, then 3, then whole again. She set it on the nail where the wall did not flinch and set her body where the woman could see a face and not a ceiling. The elder laid his hand against the stove's shoulder to steady himself when the first hard pain took the mother's breath. He expected scald. He took none. His hand came back open, unblistered, red in outline only because he had feared. At that same second a ring formed around the kettle's rim, a white brush of frost, so thin you could mistake it for a trick of rag on iron. He did not put a name to it. He called his fear down into his shoes the way friends call their thoughts down before they speak aloud at meeting. He passed the news inward instead. We are tried. We are preserved. He thought those words once, not because he wished to be brave, but because speech must be kept plain. Men moved upstairs, heavier than they needed to be, because weight felt honest. Pistols brushed benches. Papers rustled in coat pockets that had no right to contain them. Somebody's boot took the floor in the wrong place, and the panel trembled in a way only a man inside the floor could feel. Ruth said, "Breathe," as if she had the right to say that to the world and to a woman both. Some commands are earned in kitchens long before the law comes to test them. The first boy came with the steady insistence of water proud of its bed. He spilled red and Ruth's hands were blue, and yet he lay not shivering, and not still, but in that middle place where a newborn lives, if mercy bothers to remember our custom. He drew air as if someone had taught him politely. Ruth wrote later, in a hand that refused to widen for sentiment, "First boy showed no chill though my hands were blue." The elder grimaced in gratitude, because speech might have cost a brightness the room could not afford. The second boy came while the elder counted a breath, like a friend waits for a leading, surprised at how short the distance can be between a wish and its answer when danger is in the room. Upstairs a dog shook itself and lay down in the wrong place because a man he trusted had spoken too loudly. Outside, the sky decided to mean it and threw flakes larger than a brass coin against the door. The boys above who were meant to do nothing accomplished that art in a way that put shame on their fathers. The midwife cut and tied and hushed and counted, and touched the mother's cheek with the back of her hand, as if to take a fever from her by fair play. The third boy made a sound that agreed with the other 2 before he saw them. The 3 cries rose not one after another, but braided, as if one body remembered it was 3 only at the last second and insisted gently on its right to be so. Ruth thought, "You will be named later," and wiped the small mouth and placed him where she had placed his brothers, cloth in corners, fire between them, because it had to be between everyone tonight. The hourglass on the shelf spilled its sand in a long, quiet miracle, and then paused. No hand turned it. No man dared reach it for fear the jar would rattle, and the sheriff would hear, and ask why a worship house owned a thing now seen in parlors as well. The sand lay across its own throat like a scarf, and then unlearned the trick and humbled itself back into flow. The elder could smell horses above, steam, leather, a note of a man's coat kept too near bacon too long, and then those smells faded in a draft that learned to walk left to right, and then right to left, and then decided to hold. He put his hand half lifted again to the stove, then set it down again. He did not test fortune more than once in a night if it could be avoided. Ruth took the hour without giving it more attention than it deserved. She hauled third afterbirth, forced up a clot with a palm that has saved more lives than any statute ever bothered to, fed the mother a spoon with sugar that cost someone serious kindness last summer, wiped her hands in a way that taught anyone watching to wipe their own souls at the same time. Above, the elder applied his voice to men who could not be taught to fear God in any house and told them that their papers were wrong for this room. Words did their duty and then had to stand back. Presence did the rest. The men left for a little while. Their intention hung in the joists like breath on a cold morning. Ruth swaddled 3 boys and put the one that trembled least near the kettle, and the one that looked oldest near the mother's shoulder, and the one that had cried hardest at first near the cloth she had set aside to change out. When the present cloth had done its service, she wrote it later plain. 3 corners, 3 blankets. The lantern hesitated and learned obedience. Every clock we owned fell still at the same minute, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. A night, too, the room had learned its names overnight, and refused to offer them to anyone who would not pay in silence. The stovepipe had shed its first burnt rosin and smelled of iron and apology. The frost rim came and went as the elder's temper came and went, and he did not need to be told, which is the more dangerous in a room where 3 babies are learning the evenness of air. They tried what patience required: separate the infants, let each sleep its own sleep, see whether dreams can be taught to mind their corners. The mother slept as mothers do, dangling between the small trough of rest and the immediate return to labor for another reason entirely. Ruth kept her hand ready on the cloth, not because she feared blood, but because a night like this can set off the body's old impulses at the wrong time, and a woman can leave the room with frightening efficiency without intending to. The elder rode upstairs and back down with a pocketful of news that he kept out of the ledger, because words like treaty and marshal and fee have a way of teaching children panic when the household wants to teach breaths instead. The boys woke as one body decides to open its eyes in 3 places. Ruth wrote, each boy slept until another stirred, then all 3 opened their eyes at once and fixed on the same point in the ceiling where no knot exists. She did not write about the feeling of it, the way the room itself chose to point. But the ledger's simple sentence does the work honestly enough. You can hear the floorboards hold their breath when you read it. A pocket compass, the elder's old brass with a hairline in its glass like any other device on the ridge that winter, sat on a beam where it had been left by someone with too many matters in hand. It spun once and then settled like a will, north no matter where you laid it, north even when handled to face the wall where north is not known to go. It's an idle trick anyone can fake with a magnet and malice. A man might say later in a city, when he has the luxury to be clever. It is not a trick men in that room would have risked. They liked their route honest. Still, the compass kept its decision without consultation. Ruth wrote that down too, even though she did not wish to give the page any fat it had not earned. The lantern split its flame. 3 tongues. A bright braid one. Fear teaches people to throw words like wonder at phenomena that would rather be left in plain talk. Lanterns can gutter. Men who have needed them all their lives are respectful of their hesitations. It is not ordinary for one to make itself several without losing light, and then mend without showing smoke. Ruth held her breath for a second, because she had been taught to do that when a child holds his. The elder looked at the mother to see whether a mortal woman had indeed just done the thing men sing about in psalms. Divide without failing, multiply without trumpeting. She was too tired to be a symbol. She drank sugar water and wept once so quickly that it did not get to fall. There are always men above if there are men below. Dogs passed with sense and without mercy. A pair of horses shayed at nothing at the same place on the road, and then calmed when they should not have. Then came the sound a friend learns to dread, the deliberate footfalls of men who can afford to pretend they are not afraid of their own bodies. They were not at the door. They were on the ridge. They had learned to look down on houses like this and not feel the law lean on their shoulders. They paused, like men who have been taught to stop at every band of trees and listen for a secret that is old enough to resent being hunted. They moved on. The lower room discovered it had learned to breathe with the room above. Ruth had no time to name it. She wrote it as simply as she could. The cellar breathed with the breaths above it. There is no science in that line except the kind men employ when they know how many pigs they can keep alive in a small space without giving disease a fair chance. She tested what she was allowed. A pin, a heel, a dot. She did not own chloroform and would not have used it here if she had. She did not believe in torture. She believed in the kind of proof one cannot later regret having taken. She touched one foot with the point so lightly that no adult would have noticed. The foot flinched. She removed the pin. A dot of red came at all three heels. Will impossibly careful men later say she must have pressed more than she remembered? Yes. Will men who do not fear pistol and paper say she must have moved the second heels with her own hand? Yes. Ruth wrote what had happened in the only words her discipline permits. She left the commentary to men who own desks. Near midnight, a word without meaning in a winter that teaches a meeting house to judge time by its own strangenesses. The back stoop took a wait. 3 knocks. The elder answered once. A conductor, salt white with fear and anger that had turned in him for lack of a safer object, put his head in the door and said the sentence people in those rooms taught their mouths to say without trembling the usual path is watched. He waited for a map from a man, because that is a habit even friends cannot always unlearn. The elder opened his mouth to offer quiet. He lifted his hand without intending to. Before any friend's words could propose, the 3 infants in the blankets, one near the stove, one near the mother, one near the shelf, made a meeting of sounds, a wet consonant, a small coo, a soft cough, not a sob, not a cry. 3 noises men would dismiss as babies learning to try out the edges of their instruments. The men listened with their best natures, the ones they had built over and against what chaos had made of them. They heard the noises as if they were directions. Left, low, stop. They did not assign grammar. They took a route. They chose the creek bed and a culvert that low men use. It held. No one died that night. The meeting minute later said preserved. There is a limit to how far plain speech will stretch and still be itself. That sentence is it. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Night 3, snow on the stones made the sound of a man sharpening. Nothing like a storm, everything like persistence. The elder had slept an hour standing up at a post, because he will always deny that his body insists on what boys' bodies do without thinking about it. Ruth slept for 12 minutes, mouth open, one hand on the mother's face, because a midwife is no one if she does not remind the body to come back. A physician arrived grimed with sleet and scorn folded into his coat the way doctors bring their contempt with them, as a prophylactic against surprise. Someone had sent for him because the elder believed in witnesses, even when he did not believe in written law. He climbed down the narrow stair, without allowing his pride to stoop. Pride is strong enough to keep a man tall, where courtesy asks him to bend, and the lower room did not punish him for it. He placed his fingers upon 3 wrists. Ruth watched his knuckles, because midwives learn anatomy as information about what kind of man you are dealing with. His face rearranged itself twice, once at the first pulses, together, ready, the basic decent habit of flesh toward breath, and once when the 3 rhythm wandered a hair from one another. He lifted his hands away as if stung. He placed them down again before his mind had time to foreclose on the possibility that he had experienced a sensation instead of observed one. He spoke words through his teeth so as not to oblige himself to call them cool. Begin together, slip, begin again precisely at the entrance of certain words. He did not call the words holy. He called them the mother's name. The boys obliged the name with form. He wrote something in a little book and tipped the book away from Ruth's glance, not because he feared she would steal his material, but because men trained in cities still live inside their habits. When stones are speaking under their feet, he produced a mirror polished enough to disappoint anyone who has learned to trust surface only when it always lies a little. He asked each child to fix the lantern light with his eyes and the mirror with his will. The mirror gave back only one reflection. He turned it. The reflection did not change its accountability. He frowned. He placed the mirror down hard on the shelf as if to teach it temperance. The lantern hesitated politely and then went on with its task, because it had learned what it was to be scolded by people who could not make their own fire. Above, toward dawn, slave catchers and a marshal's man returned with a paper that had learned to think too highly of itself. They laid their breath on the door in the form of law. 3 knocks sounded there, not the code, but the habit men have when they want to say, "I will not go away." They expected one answer if any answer came at all. 3, clean, measured, agreeably plain, sounded from the cellar. No hand had moved. The elder closed his eyes because joy is a sin when it cannot be paid for by a deed, and no deed could pay for that sound that day. A clock on the shelf, woodworks, 8-day, nothing fancy, honest hand, painted glass blurred by heat and years, stopped at 3:33. Ruth put the number down because she had to. The elder saw her write it and asked her to cross it once, because sometimes a number calls itself back into a room when you open the door for it, and the meeting had decided there were already too many that had wandered in of their own account. She crossed it and wrote it again, and crossed the second one with a thinner line. He refused to speak the digits aloud after that night, not out of fear that a child would be taught to dread, but out of respect for an hour that had done its work. They kept the boys apart because the room had taught them caution. Ruth wrote, "Their breaths begin to wander like 3 ends of one rope laid upon a table, and then are called back to braid by the touch of the mother's hand." It is a sentence no journal would publish any more, unless it wished to be mocked by men who would not know what to make of someone else's rope if it fell on them from a height. It is the best measure a room can afford when law is at its door. You count what can be counted without becoming the thing you fear. The physician left with his draft wet under his coat. He had decided to risk the sneer of a man in Cincinnati who would call him credulous, and to risk also the kindness of an editor who would write phenomenon and call the matter contained. He took the long way because the short way was watched. Men like him accept danger while minimizing its existence even then. He would write later words that used Latin backyard names for what Ruth had lived. Simultaneous reflex, mirror touch. He would sign his name and not tell the truth about the shakes in his hands halfway to Marietta when the road pitched, and the lantern at his own reticule leaned, and he saw 3 faces where 2 clouds had divided in a wind that still held snow in its mouth. The marshal held paper in the meeting and was asked to sit. He did. The elder offered him water and the truth, and he took one and denied the other. This is not to shame him. Men of his trade that winter could not afford the truth if they wished to pay their children's hunger with it. The men knocked again with the back of a hand. The door answered in the lower room without a person attached to it. 3 belongs to us, the room said, and then the room gave the number back to air. Quaker plain speech has no adjectives because adjectives teach pride how to dress. The ledger's last line that night, before the midwife put her hand on the page to hold it down from writing what her mind wanted to, says only we chose silence. We went upstairs. Silence is the last skill friends keep when law invites dialogue. Silence, then a straw in a corner that has been taught to pretend it does not know what it holds. Then winter, Then slow rooms full of people eating bread with less salt than they ought and grateful for it. Upstairs. The men avoided eye contact with one another, because they had done something together that cannot be written even by meetings that pride themselves on minutes. The marshal kept his dignity and knew while keeping it that it had not been welcomed into the business of the house. The sheriff shook his coat and decided to have a cough later. The elder wiped the stove bin and set a pan on it, not because bread needed to be made that minute, but because symbols. One shovel of ash, one pan, one cloth, keep a family from their own excitement's pride, when pride would be deadly. Ruth moved the 3 blankets by inches until her hand remembered where they could sleep and not cheat air. The mother woke and did not know exactly which of the 3 she had touched in her dreams. She cared, and she did not care. She called the 3 names she had been given permission to say aloud. They answered by ordinary means. The ordinary is the greatest mercy available to any woman who has survived a dangerous night. There were disputes then, and there are still. One says the reflection in the mirror belonged to one boy, not to an agreement. One says the mirror was cheap with its silver worn thin. One says the physician could make anything about himself, even the stillness of a clock that would not speak his language, and so decided to use silence to be rude. One says the sound from the cellar was only an old trick, rope tied under the floor to a shutter that has learned to slap. And then the same man will tell a story about watching a table lift under the hands of ladies in a parlor and call it devil. Ruth wrote none of that. The ledger set down its modest record, like a plank over cold water, and asked everyone who needed the plank to put their feet carefully. The next day would be ordinary by demand and by stubbornness. Men would speak oaths. Women would speak lie. Children would be told the stove must be respected, because even in its better moods it is a hazard. Ruth would sleep for 40 minutes like a soldier, and wake ready to tell the elder to eat something he could taste, so that his tongue would remember its work. The boys upstairs would ride the ridge committed to their fragile roots. The lower room would cool. The lantern would be trimmed. The elder would seat the bar across the door with a hand that shook more than he would later admit. And the ledger would close itself under beeswax later, because a room that has served must have its breath kept, and a story that has saved must be hidden before men can ruin it by admiration. They did not let the ledger be the only witness. Men came with measuring words and made cases out of a night that had begged to be left plain. Each account carried its own proof the way a body carries its pulse, felt most strongly in the wrist of the teller. Every time one theory took a full breath, another cleared its throat. The page did not change. It lay with its beeswax shine and let everyone speak. The naturalists had the first word, because winter gives doctors work. Cincinnati men, and a few country practitioners, who kept their boots clean for the sake of respectability, wrote letters that tried to fold the cellar into a case study that would not stain their tablecloths. One in the Western Lancet printed a paragraph years later. Mirror-touch synesthesia is what he would have called it if the term had existed. He used reflex sympathy. Instead, we have seen impaired subjects. He wrote, a sensibility crossed, tickle the one, and the other disports, prick the heel, and 3 crimson at once is but multiplication of the known. He lined up monoamniotic triads, as if naming the rarity would serve as a calming draught. He did not mention the lantern. He did not mention the knocks. Men like him learned to ignore the parts of a night that did not wish to be weighed. A clockmaker in Marietta, who meant no harm and believed in the comfort of craft, wrote to a county history in 1879 that shelf clocks stop in cold rooms at predictable minutes when their pawls are gummy. 3 minutes after half past the hour is the commonplace, he said. Oil goes thick, wood teeth swell and swell back. The hand obliges a physics, not a miracle. He had a drawer full of repaired brass to prove it. Then a friend's descendant wrote nothing in reply, but kept both her clocks running with corn oil and marked that they did not pause in January's nor in July's except at 3:33, and then remembered themselves as if embarrassed for the extravagance. The compass can be made to lie, a regular insisted. A 4 penny nail under the beam, a fence wire in a wall, a pocket magnet in a child's wrap. Countrymen who sail told him quietly that an old brass with its own superstitions will ignore tricks when it has decided, and a house that had promised not to betray a rout would have thrown a man downstairs for trying to make it falls on purpose that week. They did not bother to print that. You cannot prove a house has morals to a reader who has never hidden anyone in one. The mesmeric sort came next with their velvet and their wireless pride. They walked through Marietta and Zanesville and Parkersburg in those years with Faraday cages and coils, and coaxed frogs to kick in audiences that had not come prepared for God to be displaced by a battery. One such lecturer, he signed his hand merely, A. Lowell, electro-biologist, tacked a theory onto the Quaker cellar to sell chairs in the Odd Fellows Hall. Friends are easy glass, he said, forgetting he was saying so in a town where friends had taught men not to turn the other way when law behaved indecently. The elder, being exposed to demonstrations, became an unwitting operator. Suggestion flowed. Infants are the perfect mirror. The lantern splitting, drafts, chimneys with forks above the throat, the knocks, ropes tied under the floor to a shutter that learned to do theater, the compass, a magnet placed, as an experiment, to satisfy the cleverness of a doctor who had paid to be clever. If you have lived in rooms built to keep men alive, you know when a man like that speaks, he is not practicing science. He is soothing his dread with toys. Friends spoke differently, and you must understand how much it cost them to speak at all. The inner light, they said softly in the women's meeting, sometimes shines in one and sometimes in all, and now and then, when a room has more being hunted than any sheriff's paper can name, it discovers how to speak with three mouths and still be one voice. We were tried. We were preserved, the minute said. Then a weight rose and another friend stood and warned that gifts taken for wonders become weights themselves, and pride will find a handle on them, and men will pull at that handle until the gift tears and injures a house. It is not false humility to remove your adjective from a night that saved 12 lives. It is modesty with gunpowder on the stairs. The liberation stories, those carried by people who dragged handcarts and hid them in their own hearts. Do not bother to give theories a full chair. They say simply that Winter taught the line a new tool, and the line used it carefully. Conductors' grandchildren say 3 small sounds were used in the dark as a map that only a particular fear could read. A wet consonant meant the culvert, a small coo meant the foxpath, a soft cough meant stop. They say it came once and then never again, because grace is rare and repeats itself only when men have learned to behave and will not make a spectacle out of it. A retired sheriff, who had met his own better self too late to be useful that year, told his son at the end of his life that he had seen a U.S. Marshal's file with 2 pages glued together, where the entry for a visit to a Quaker meeting ought to be. You will say paper sticks from damp. He swore he saw paste and human choice in the seam, and not merely December. There is a crueler account that has to be included if only to show where it learned its breath. After the war, the men who had loved slavery and survived refused to let anyone else have freedom without cost. They said a night like that must taint the children, unnatural, mongrel, freaks of cold and secrecy. They almost spat, and when a century turned and eugenic talk wore lab coats, children like those boys were volunteered in absentia for sterilization by men whose labors had never included any room in which either mercy or danger had become a skill. Families in the line refused to answer that kind of slander by breath. They did not print anything at all. They made quilts with 3 pinwheels and gave them to women who needed to feel their sons, wrapped in something that did not come from a store. They taught their boys to knock 3 times on a kitchen table at a certain hour if panic took them, so that someone would come sit and listen and take the clocks off the mantel quietly. In 1909, a psychical research club in Cleveland printed a study under initials only a T, E, W, and G. 3 cousins, age 17, display an apparent clock influence. They measured, they ticked, they interviewed, they wrote. No evidence of fraud, because that is what such clubs always write when they do not discover what they needed to discover to keep their rooms full. They wrote also, in a last line not meant for publication, but found in the margin later by a librarian with a better soul than budget, "We left without our laughter." That is the finest result you can ask from a man who has come to a cellar looking for a trick. Family lore is a softer lumber. Mothers in that line say the ability, call it a gift if you wish, to keep your supper warm, comes pale some years and loud in others. In 1933, 3 cousins fell asleep in a single room to save coal and woke with the same short dream in their mouths. The map of a creek, a scene by a fox, they keep saying, and nobody knows why the animal matters except that foxes remember how not to be seen without turning cruel about it. In 1957, an aunt laid her palm on a stopped mantel clock, asked kindly, and the minute hand slid forward 1 minute, without the gears obliging, "Does a person lie about a thing so small if there is no good reason to?" She told only her sister, who kept the quilts and the ledger in a new shoebox, and the habit of 3 knocks in a house that had no basement and no sheriff. There is a county clerk who wrote 2 files to soothe himself, one labeled irregularity, into which he put physician drafts with language too fashionably French, one labeled rumor, into which he put notes about knocks and quilts and girls who flickered like lanterns when their brothers were ill. He kept both folders alive long enough to die, and then a young man with a righteous zeal for paper consolidated them and tossed the second in the bin behind the courthouse. A janitor took it home because he liked to read what other men threw away. A grandson of his turned the papers over to the Historical Society in 1981, and that is why you can read in his hand 3 black handprints in suit, copied from a WPA card that had carried only a triangle in pencil where the place was supposed to be. Some future-minded historians, poor souls who are paid in trust that people will listen to them and are disappointed as often as midwives, argue misremembering. They teach us that families knit finer into retellings every year. They say the 3 handprints were put there by children long after the night, the way a story begs to be marked by smaller hands who want it to fit. They say midwives are blessed liars who trade accuracy for compassion. They say Quaker minutes cut names not to save lives but to serve a cult of plainness. That is an easy sentence to write if the statute that hunted people like rabbits no longer sits on your table, and no one you love has been offered a reward, like bacon for showing where they sleep. There is a malignant version with a scalp lock of truth on it that we should calm a doctor tried to remove the boys. One file, unsigned, says a gentleman with a letter from Cincinnati knocked and desired to study the infants for the good of all men. A friend at the door pointed at the letter and said meekly, "Thee may keep that," and shut the door. The doctor wrote to a marshal, and if you wish to know why friends learn to keep silence more carefully than before, look at the places where the marshal's book goes blank after a name. You can smell paste even without seeing it. There are professional doubters who handle paste better than any minister. A man in the 1970s. He taught at a good school and had the kind of spectacles that make students forget to disagree. Published a small piece in a state history that scolded everyone. The Underground Railroad, he said, is 90% romance. Not wrong as a rebuke to men who like nostalgia better than accountability. He footnoted the ledger once and wrote, "Midwives are unreliable narrators. You can tell the size of his dining table by how he treats the women who hold him to it alive." The WPA inventory left a triangle in pencil on a 3x5. A 1954 county piped that entry without the triangle, because the typist believed she was editing errors and not courage. In 1981, a librarian found the graphite still bright. She wrote on the back, "This is one to keep in sight." She did not mean it was worth admission. She meant paper has a habit of hiding itself, and an older habit of deciding to come back into rooms where it can be put to work. Friends' own words give strangers hammers if the strangers are careless. Friends Were Tried can be read as an advertisement to men who delight in trial more than they delight in mercy. That is why elders sometimes remove the sentence that would give a cruel reader a theme. It's why the ledger has 3 entries with the right number of nouns and none of the music men want when they sniff a wonder. flesh and blood, and 3 knocks and a clock. There are nights when clicking consonants do more work than adjectives, and people survive because a minute refused to move until they had found the right door. There is a story the younger ones like because it is almost tender. A man took the lantern splitting and made a sermon out of it in a Baptist church down the river. He made the flame the Trinity, and the mending the church, and the cellar the world. His people were glad because it made a dangerous thing sound like something to look at, and not something that wants your body. Somebody in the back row, not a friend, but the wife of a friend who had married out, stood up, waited for weight, and said softly, "I think thee should not." The man sat down and read a psalm, instead because Indiana had taught him the cost of raising your voice wrongly in rooms with too much timber. The last theory wants no crown. It says the cellar mattered as a place first and a story second. It says that what the ledger names, "We were preserved," is a better sentence than any doctor has offered it, and any stage man has sold. It says the triplets did not break a law of physiology. They braided a skill the night demanded. It says the Quaker habit of refusing to name everything is not cowardice. It is carpentry for days when naming would knock holes where a house cannot afford them. It says sometimes 3 boys breathe alike because a mother's hand did not have room to be wrong. It says the clocks were not doing theater. They were obeying a request that laws written in cities do not honor. What can be held of all of it lies in a small ring of facts that do not ask for applause. 3 boys were born under a meeting house, while men with papers stood on a ridge and called themselves lawful. A midwife did her work without adjectives. A clerk wrote sentences that were too small for the size of his relief on purpose. A physician felt his own craft slip sideways once, and then recovered it with Latin. A marshal knocked and the cellar answered him with a number his papers could not print. A clock stopped at 3:33, and then remembered itself when kindness asked it to. Families taught children to knock 3 times on their own doors when they needed help, because winter does not care whether you use your voice or your palm so long as someone answers. The hill went on being a hill. The stones do not change their story when a theory closes or fails. The house is gone and the road has forgotten how to slow for it, but the ground keeps the shape it was taught. A ring of stones lies low in the brush at the edge of a cornfield, and the owner calls it old footing. When he is asked, he keeps his voice easy. He does not mention the winter the tractor's rear wheel slid its own weight away from those stones on a dry day, as if remembering being told, "Not over," by a hand that has been dust for a century. He mows around the circle without noticing that he has chosen a path that leaves a strip of clover a hand's breadth wide and smooth. In snow, 3 clear circles appear where the drift should sit even, not melted, simply thin, like 3 breath prints laid down before the storm arrived. If you stand on the ring in January and knock 3 times with your knuckles, you will feel the 3rd knock come back through your bones, not your ears, once careful. As if something in the hill has been taught not to waste sound. People go there to prove they do not believe in it. They do not announce their intention loudly to their wives. They bring a flask and a laugh. Some bring a compass to make a ceremony of the disappointment they have planned for themselves. Some bring a clock because cruelty has a way of trying to make wonder serve it. The compass behaves as it should until the hand is steady enough to forget itself, and then it will look at the same wall in any position. The clock takes a minute's holiday at 3:33 and returns to its place without muttering. Men who have taught their bodies to step into danger without hesitating flinch at the wrong time, and then straighten themselves as if their shoulders were being watched by a marshal no one can see. The 3 suit handprints on the cellar wall do not ask for those men. They call descendants from a distance most of the year. A woman in her 60s brought her sons-ins in 1975 and set them to sit on the stone ring with their feet pressed flat, because she had been told to do that by a grandmother who had once been told to do the same by a woman, whose name she never learned, because friends prefer to keep names at a distance where pride cannot reach. The boys fell asleep in the car on the way home and woke both at the exact same point in the county line, with a short sentence in their mouths. "We have to cross twice," they said, and neither could explain the grammar, and the mother did not ask them to. The next day a storm took a tree down and laid it across the regular route and made the family drive around by the old culvert, and attending the pontoon replacement a sheriff shook his head and said, "Cross twice. Good advice." A plain set of rules has followed the line like a small discipline stitched into an apron hem. Do not separate the boys of a generation for longer than 3 hours during fever season. Do not speak a full name alone. If you must call a child, call him by a piece of his name or call all three together. If a watch halts under your palm, and you have asked kindly, set it forward when it wakes again, never back. Make time keep its yes. Quilts appear and disappear in these houses like weather with manners triple pinwheels inside an hourglass border. Never hung where strangers can count them, always laid across knees the first night a child sleeps away from his mother. The WPA inventory in 1937 sent a man who did not believe in soft pencils. He wrote, "Quaker cellar with 3 suit prints at shoulder height," and drew a crisp triangle in the margin, his own private code for look again. He had learned that you put a good mark where a county history might refuse to carry anything you loved. In 1954, a woman retyped the card for a pamphlet and left the triangle out because triangles do not belong beside Quaker sentences. She believed she was correcting grammar in an obituary. In 1981, a librarian, whose patience was greater than her salary, found both the graphite still bright. She wrote on the back of the old card, "This is one to keep in sight," and kept the triangle in the drawer out of her desire to see 2 things paired, if they had behaved that way once and had paid to find each other again. Clocks behave like weary animals in this story. In kitchens of descendants, at 3:33 every day or not at all for months, shelf clocks pause as if they have remembered an appointment. The second hand see if the family has allowed itself such vanity as a second hand swings and then refuses to count, and then resumes with a politeness that saves everyone's face. Digital faces do not admit to pausing. They are proud of their cold. Later someone notices a minute gained that cannot be blamed on daylight saving or on a battered set of teeth in a wooden gear. A man in 1999 laid his palm on a stopped clock and asked kindly, and the minute hand glided forward without the noise the works ought to make when going about their duty. He told nobody but his sister, who keeps the quilts. She looked at his face and did not laugh. He set the clock forward because someone in his house had learned that to push time back is to unlearn gratitude. Hospitals offer their own small confessions when the line arrives inside them. 3 cousins in 2003 were admitted with 3 different reasons and 3 different rooms, a fever, a sprain, an observation that turned out to be caution rather than emergency. The monitors over 3 beds slipped into the same rhythm at 3:33 in the morning. Nurses, tired enough to believe everything and nothing, glanced at the lights and did their rounds, and told one another later at the station that the thoracic floor was conducting again. The charge nurse shushed them because she did not want the word to travel upstairs to the family waiting room and frighten a mother with the wrong kind of explanation. Phones have learned a new habit. The children's grandchildren will tell you that some screens turn black at 3:33 for 1 minute and then bring back their blue faces as if the pause had been a kindness. The boys later grown into men find that their navigation apps will refuse to calculate a route northeast from the meeting house stones for about a minute and then offer 3 identical routes, ranked 1, 1, and 1, their software uncertain how to outvote the order the hill has learned to prefer. This is not proof of anything except that the local phones have a sense of humor and the ridges produce signal poorly. And yet men who do not intend to tell stories of any kind go quiet when it is mentioned. The ledger finds a second life in the climate drawer and teaches its keepers a superstition. Archivists do not read the mirror script and the forward line together out loud, and not because they worry about conjuring anything that ought not to be conjured, but because twice is a kind of mockery, and a book that saved people's bodies should not be made to carry anyone's cleverness. The pressed hair that crosses the broken sentence has never been lifted. It lies darker than hair should when hair is not growing, because hair is the only part of the body that will obey certain requests without asking why. Raking light shows the gloss of a hand that pressed the page down in a room where a marshal was knocking above. The gloss remains, and men who think they are not sentimental will trace it, and then wipe their fingers on a pocket handkerchief, as if such a gesture could erase the fact that they have borrowed something from the dead. Friends today keep the weight differently and the same. There is a letter in a modern minute, typed, "Friends were made heavy by remembrance. We were preserved." They do not name any gift. They do not name any harm. They do not bring the word miracle into a room that will not host it. They teach plain children to sit without fidgeting and to wait for a leading if one comes, and they do not tell those children about men who crawled across a cellar while dogs exchanged news between each other above with their tails and their tongues. They sew quilts with pinwheels and hourglasses, because a woman who chooses stars would be saying something she did not intend, and because a woman who keeps purely blocks would refuse to admit that speed and time have anything to do with mercy, which is not true. The family rules are short and are not written anywhere but inside arms. If 3 boys are born into a generation, do not let them sleep alone the first 3 nights of any fever. If one learns to halt a clock, teach him to ask kindly and to set the hand forward after so that gratitude leads and not pride. Knock 3 times when panic takes you, and do not be afraid to be answered by a single knock if you have not heard any other kindness that day. Do not be the man who tells a county where to go to hear a sound. Do not pick at paper paste. If a marshal's pages are stuck, leave them so. People have paid enough for certain silences. There are still men who come to take measurements. In 2007, a small television crew arrived with meters that blinked and chirped in ways designed to support ad space. The ring answered none of their questions. Their recorded footage was not quite right. The audio slid a minute to the left of the visual. The editor called the station engineer and asked what could cause such delay. "Gremlins," the engineer said. The editor snorted and cued a new frame and did not notice that his hand stopped on the top of the minute in the lower right of his board, 303. Some of the line went west. You will know them in houses of worship you would not think would host Friends, Pentecostal barns, and Lutheran boxes and Episcopalian ships. They duck their heads at 3:33 and look at their children and straighten the plate and ask the person next to them for forgiveness, when forgiveness did not need to be asked just then. They do not stand to explain what has just been done. They do not write it down. They press their hand for a second against the face of a clock, not to show, not to command, to be instructed. Clocks, when prayed to properly, are the humblest devices we still keep on mantels. The Cincinnati draft left by the physician might yet be found under a layer of proper publications. Someone in a city once paid to teach his students to find the cheap paper first and the good paper after will stand up and go to a basement and ask a clerk who should have already gone home whether any of the unindexed-bound volumes from the 1850s have been relabeled. The clerk will shrug because basements are patient. He will bring up a box. It will smell like damp confidence. The draft may be in it. The doctor will have spared himself the adjective and written what he could. Pulse begins together. Drifts begins. Mirror reflects one. Clock halts and resumes. Phenomenon. The adjective, singular, will be the one thing he could not help. You will read the rest and be no happier than before, because reading is not the same as being responsible for what you now know how to keep. The marshal's 2 blank pages might be held together by decision and not by weather. Perhaps they cover a refusal that would make us proud if we could bear the cost of it. Perhaps someone known for a lack of temper allowed himself to be taught by his better nature once in a life and pasted the record shut because he had children and had not stopped being the kind of man who liked to think himself lawful. Friends do not make icons out of their enemies' better moments. That is a different church's error. If you go to the stone ring at noon and bring no clock, you will be forced to measure like your grandparents. The wind will tell you which way the river goes. The trees will tell you which way weather is lately. Your body will tell you whether you are afraid for the right reasons. If you knock, and you will, do it 3 times quickly, and then once slow. If you are answered in your bones, do not announce it to the stones as if they would be flattered. Say thank thee under your breath. Go home and feed someone. Do not count the quivers in the minute hand in front of anyone who did not ask you to. Perhaps you will bring your hands to the stones, and then to the court drawers. Perhaps the Cincinnati draft lies under a kind word, and an old glue that only requires a clean steam kettle and a kinder patience than your day provides. Perhaps the marshal's pages hide an obedience to conscience that would be pleasant to most religions and terrifying to any government that cannot think quickly enough to call it an exception. Perhaps the triplets drew down light because the night warranted it and did not ask the gift to stay a day longer than needed. Perhaps all that remains is the courtesy of 3. If you want me to continue uncovering these buried histories, subscribe now and share your theory in the comments. Were those boys a shared nervous system, a living compass, a Quaker parable that refused to live only as speech? Did the clocks pause out of oil and winter, or because someone taught time how to mind its own business when a house needed to hold still? People here still knock 3 times on stone and expect to be answered in once. The hill keeps its own count. The rest is what we do with the breath handed to us on a dangerous night.